Mike, welcome back to Props and Hops. I'm excited to dig in on some football talk, conference championship recap, looking ahead to the Super Bowl a bit, then really focusing on the meat of this conversation, how to win at sports betting. But first things first with Props and Hops, how are you doing and what are you drinking tonight?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thank you so much for having me back on. I believe I'm the first repeat guest of the Props and Hops podcast, so I feel very honored. And I'm drinking a nice. This one I totally just got into recently, out here in Chicagoland. So I don't know exactly where they sell it, but it's Around the Bend Beer Company. It's called the Vera Pistachio Cream Ale. So if you're into
Mhm.
like pistachio and that taste, it's subtle, but it's been like the beer I've been drinking the most the past week or so. I drank like 4 or 5 of them during the AFC and NFC championship games over the weekend. So it's really good. So gets the 5 star
Yeah.
review from me.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the cream ale is a pretty rare style out here in Southern California. There's a brewery called Mother Earth that makes one called Cali Creamin', and it's a vanilla cream ale. So different flavor profile going from vanilla to pistachio, but I think similar in that, yeah, if you want to put away 4 or 5 of those in one sitting watching football, you can definitely do it.
It's
And
doable.
I guess to transition over to what I've got going tonight, this was the conference championship weekend show beer on Props and Hops. Rough translation, it's a Kolsch by Green Cheek, my favorite brewery. As viewers watching this on YouTube will be able to see with the shirt I've got on as well. Definitely a homer for my guys over at Green Cheek. So another just crusher. Got a couple left for Super Sunday as well. Just spectacular for back-to-back weekends of awesome days of playoff football, almost wall to wall. So yeah, when you want to have maybe 4 or 5 over the course of a long day, but still keep your wits about you, whether it's something like a Kolsch or a cream ale, can't really go wrong. So cheers.
Yeah. Cheers. I also have a
No.
belly full of tacos as well. So I'm ready to rock here and talk some football with you. It's gonna be a really fun talk. I'm excited.
Perfect. Yeah, likewise. Well, on that note, since we had you on the show in November, I know we've flipped the calendar over to a new year, and then you've also taken on a new job in the sports betting space. So I'd love it if you could walk us through what that job is and how that's going for you.
Yeah, so I accepted a new position as Chief Compliance and Legal Officer at PlayUp USA. So PlayUp, for those of you unfamiliar, it's a very popular, prominent Australian DFS company. And they do sports betting too, and licensed in India as well. And they're looking to make a move into the space here, the U.S. sports betting space, and make a one-stop shop for sports betting, for pari-mutuel fixed odds horse racing, and for among other things, DFS, and want to get involved in the game here in America. So they have the new U.S. team that they're looking to head up and introduce to new markets here. We have market access already in New Jersey and Colorado. And New Jersey is the priority right now. So if you're out in New Jersey, be on the lookout for PlayUp to be the newest sports book coming soon. It's hopefully going to be sooner than later, but we're in the process right now of going through the final stages to get that book available for everyone to bet on in New Jersey. So fun times ahead. I'm really excited to be a part of it. Dr. Layla Mintus, a former professor of mine at the University of New Hampshire Sports Wagering and Integrity Program. She's our U.S. CEO. So I was actually the second hire here in the U.S. So we're building the team right now, but it's really fun to be a part of a company like this that's looking to disrupt the space here in the U.S. with sports betting and iGaming. So I'm excited about it. Just trying to work with state regulators and try and get us in as many states as possible.
Yeah, and I know you have a legal background. I mean, last time we had you on, we talked specifically about sports betting legalization, and I won't be able to help myself from bringing that up again shortly for a possible batch of updates. But
Mhm.
what's it like being on this end of it now, applying your legal background um, in a time of legalization sweeping the nation and getting things up and running with a new outlet for a bunch of states across the country, knowing that as a bettor at the same time, having more outs is often the name of the game.
Yeah, no, it's like really fun. It's cool for me because I'm wearing like kind of two separate hats, obviously, and doing my own sports betting podcast. And I'm a bettor myself, as obviously we're going to talk about a lot of that today. But it's fun for me just being involved from the legal side and kind of marrying my legal background with what I'm interested in, and that's obviously the newly legal regulated sports betting industry here in the U.S. And there's changes by the day. I mean, there's been changes since the last time we talked, and this week there's new news every week. You can't even keep up with it because every single day there's a new piece of news that'll drop. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is going to speed up a process that I think was going to occur anyway. And I'm sure we'll get into some of this stuff, but it's just a fun space to be in. It's what I'm passionate about. So it just made perfect sense for me to try and make a career out of this stuff from the legal side.
Yeah, that's cool. It's a great time to hear you getting involved in this and kind of building something from the ground up. So definitely something we'll be monitoring in the weeks, months, and quite possibly years to come. And on that note, we will get into conference championship Sunday takeaways, initial look at Super Bowl 55, and then the meat of this conversation, how to win at sports betting. But if I'm talking with you, gotta touch on legalization a little bit as well. I know that listeners can go back to November 10th when we dropped the last episode to hear a broader overview of how things stand right now. But even fast forwarding a couple of months, I know that last week there was some big news. I guess starting off with the Wire Act, if I have it right, the First District Court of Appeals ruled that the 1961 Wire Act applied only to sporting events, which I know doesn't take off the chains in that sense, but it does reject a contention from the Department of Justice that the Wire Act also prohibited other forms of interstate gambling. So if you could just give a quick primer on what the Wire Act is, what this means for non-sports gambling, and then if you do see any possible implications for sports gambling in the future.
Yeah, it was a really big decision last week by the First Circuit Court of Appeals. It basically is keeping the status quo. So like you're not going to see any big changes or anything like that. But the Wire Act basically, as you mentioned, early 1960s federal statute, and it essentially bans interstate wagering. So you can't make a bet with a Nevada bookmaker from a state outside of Nevada. And there was confusion because back in 2011, there was a DOJ, Department of Justice opinion that basically, it solidified the fact that the Wire Act only applied to sports betting. But then back in 2018, the Department of Justice under the Trump administration came out and reversed that opinion, saying that it didn't necessarily only apply to sports betting. And of course, that scared the bejesus out of state lottery commissions and every poker player that's playing poker seriously in the United States. And they saw clarity on this, on this reversal, in a 7-year period from 2011 to 2018. And so case went to court. The district judge ruled that, the status quo shall remain, but it was brought up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and they confirmed it as well. So it is confirmed. Everyone can have a big sigh of relief. It was a big week last week because the First Circuit Court of Appeals did confirm that the Wire Act only applies to sports betting. So that allows it's going to be felt more in the poker world because interstate compacts can still be in existence where you can pool players together from multiple states. And for other things too. I mean, it really is just, it's going to keep the status quo. But for sports betting, I think this could open up the door to see, the Wire Act being revisited, not with this case necessarily, because I think that's the last we're going to hear from this case. I don't think there's any indication that the Biden administration is going to try and bring this one to the Supreme Court, which is the only place it can go now. But I think it's a good sign for people in the industry who have been watching this Wire Act issue closely over the past few years, because, in my opinion, I think it's just an outdated law. When they crafted it in the early 1960s, they didn't have, mobile wagering from the comfort of our couches in mind. So I think it's an outdated law. And I think that if anything, this is going to put us in that situation down that road, or at least further down the path of seeing the Wire Act done away with, or partially done away with, and open up the door for more similar, interstate gaming compacts when it comes to sports wagering. And that opens up the door for, a betting exchange that can work and more competitive odds for us bettors. So I think it's just a win for everybody last week in the gaming industry in general. It was a big win.
Yeah, awesome. Love hearing that take. Fingers crossed for more to come on the Wire Act in the future. And beyond the Wire Act, we also had news across the country on the legalization front last week. Mobile betting launched in Michigan. Iowa, actually, since we last spoke, Iowa started to allow mobile betting, I believe, beginning on New Year's Day. And then Virginia, surprisingly, launching legal regulated sports betting last week. Let me know if that doesn't cover everything from the last week or so. I know, to your point, things are changing so fast, generally moving the ball forward, which is encouraging to see. But yeah, does that cover the bulk of the most recent updates? And if so, what are your takeaways from this recent news?
Yeah, just like a big like start to the year. It's like, oh, 2021, all right, here with a bang. I mean, it's Michigan. We knew it was going to happen because they went live as a state for sports betting back in, I believe it was March of last year. So they've been live for a long time, but they didn't have mobile figured out. So obviously during a pandemic, when people can't even go to casinos or they're not comfortable going to casinos, it's hard to bring in that revenue and that handle when people aren't able to do the betting from their phones. So Michigan finally launched mobile last Friday. It was a big event, and we've seen multiple operators out there in the state. It's a very friendly, they have very friendly regulatory structure there that opens up the door for as many as 15 operators could have an app for people to bet on, the next couple months. I'm not sure how many have officially launched already. I know some are having some issues getting launching and going live, but it's a really big development because Michigan obviously they love sports there. They love college sports, and then in Canada, Canadians can come right down through over the Ambassador Bridge there into Michigan, and it's just it's a bigger state too. So that's definitely a state to watch moving forward. Now that they have mobile, Virginia kind of came out of nowhere. You knew that they had legalized it, but you weren't sure when it was going to launch. And then just kind of on a random, just on a whim last Wednesday, I think FanDuel announced that they were going to launch the next day. And then I believe another book has since joined them since they launched. But Virginia, they're live with mobile now too. So and then Iowa, to your point before, they could the year and a half period is now run on in-person registration, that requirement, and that's something we had here in the law in Illinois where I'm at. But Governor Pritzker, which I think we touched on in the last episode together, he here in Illinois, he issued an executive order and kept renewing it, basically removing the in-person registration requirement, which is a huge deal because people are able to, when you can have people sign up from their couches and not have to go in. You know how Gen Z is; they don't want to get up and talk to anybody. They want to do everything from their phones. So especially with this younger crop of bettors that are coming up, and then during a pandemic too, where people are just less comfortable, a lot of people less comfortable going in and physically registering. It's a big deal when you can just have your bettors signing up from the comfort of their couch.
Yeah, and circling back to something you mentioned with Virginia, specifically this timing being a bit of a surprise, knowing they had things in the works, but catching some people off guard moving forward as suddenly as they appear to have done last week. Is that related to lobbying power that FanDuel has, or any interest the state has in capturing revenue from such a precious window of NFL Conference Championship weekend leading into the Super Bowl? Was there anything behind the scenes that would really accelerate that timing because that's such a big moment of the sports betting calendar?
Yeah, no doubt that I mean, even regulators, legislators, everybody involved in this knows how big of a deal the Super Bowl is and the March Madness right around the corner. So it's important for everybody to get this done, at this time and, of the year before all these big betting events happen. So, I'm not sure how much power or lobbying sway FanDuel had, but no doubt there were a lot of interested parties that wanted to see this done at this time, and good for them. They got it done, they figured it out, and as we've touched on in the past, a lot of the states out there are figuring this out early on, and a lot of them are not. And hopefully, the ones that are not are able to learn from their mistakes and learn from others that are not. And states that have yet to launch or yet to even legalize sports betting, hopefully, they can take a page of the book from the states that are getting it right.
Yeah, well, I'm in one of those states in the category of not having figured it out yet, out here in California. And I know that in our last conversation, we touched on two really big markets with some ground still to cover: California and on the East Coast, New York, kind of a counterpart 3,000 miles away. I know the situations aren't identical between the two states, but they are far from ideal when we look at where a lot of other states already are. So again, listeners can check out the episode from early November to get that deeper dive on New York, California, and the rest of the country. But over the past 2+ months, with California and New York being such massive states, has there been any ground covered, or is it kind of just the status quo for now?
So we've seen big news out of New York. I'll touch on California really quick, just because there hasn't been much. And there was a hearing actually. Now it's been over a year. It was on January 8th of last year, before COVID and all that stuff. Before things got crazy. I remember watching it myself because a lot of prominent Vegas personalities came in, like some odds makers, Vegas, they came in to testify in front of the California lawmakers and stuff. And it's just crazy to think that we've come, over a year now since that hearing. And I know when we talked about things back in the fall, it was looking promising for California at the end of the year, but then kind of just tailed out. And we're looking at a situation where it's 2022, at best on the 2022 ballot. Getting on that ballot is probably as early as we'll see it in California. So 2023 would be my over under early 2023 on it launching there. But New York, we've seen a big development there, and mainly because Governor Cuomo has reversed his course on mobile betting, because New York has had in-person betting brick and mortar locations for a while now, and everybody knows how big New York can be when it goes live with mobile. And especially since so many New Yorkers are traveling over to New Jersey and taking their business elsewhere. But Cuomo basically came out and said, hey, we're going to look at this now, mobile betting, because the state's going to be, I think everyone's kind of expecting like a 1970s style financial crisis in New York right now due to the pandemic and people leaving the city. So the entire state of New York is going to be pressed for cash, and they're going to be looking for additional revenue sources the next few years. So they're, naturally turning to sports betting. And I think that's a good way to look for them. But then, in the same breath, Cuomo excited everybody. I remember the morning he announced that he actually explicitly mentioned sports betting as an additional revenue source, and everyone, erupted. Oh my God, this is a big deal. But then almost like in the same breath, later that same day, he said that they're going to be looking to institute a lottery style system that's similar to New Hampshire and a few other jurisdictions. And his rhetoric, was essentially along the lines of, we don't want to make money for casinos. And that's very problematic, in my opinion. And I think that a lot of people in the industry would agree with me that going down the lottery route with only one operator and a monopoly essentially is not a good long-term plan for the state of New York. And I've gone on record with this for a few years now on my podcast and other people I talk about, that the states that get it right are the ones that are fostering innovation, and they don't have overburdensome licensing fees for operators and overburdensome tax structure. It allows operators room to breathe and innovate and compete with one another, offer competitive pricing. And in turn, that's good for bettors, because bettors are price sensitive. They want to get the best number that they can find. And when there's only one operator out there, like a state like Montana you can look at, or Oregon, Washington, D.C., bettors are, some of them will take that whatever's being offered to them, but a lot are not. They're going to keep their business elsewhere, offshore in the black market. And I think that's what will happen in New York. You see some of these forecasts that they're talking about, trying like $500 million in revenue or something like that. It's just skyrocketed numbers and just like sky high numbers that they're talking about. And in that model, you really just cap what you can do, especially when New Jersey's right next door, and savvy bettors in New York City are just going to continue to travel, to bet with 15 or 20 operators in New Jersey instead of the one in New York. So it's good and bad right now. And there's definitely talk about lobbying. New York right now is definitely an interesting situation to watch, because there's a lot of parties, a lot of state lobbyists, and obviously operators. They're lobbying for a model that looks more like New Jersey, or at least not like the model that Cuomo's coming out with. So it's something to watch. There's reason for optimism, but I really hope they get this right in New York.
Cool. And one quick point to clarify. So the lottery system essentially deems it a monopoly. There's one operator, and that could mean they could price games at, if the Super Bowl were to be, this one has a little bit of extra vig on the -3 for the Chiefs, or the +3.5 for the Bucks. But let's say there's a game that's +3, -110, -3, -110 across the board.
Mm-hmm.
In a state with a lottery system, they could say, hey, we're going to do the same +3, but it's -120 either side. And that's the only option you have if you want to do this above board. Is that correct? That's the primary downside of the lottery?
Yes. The lottery system, more having the state lottery run it is basically, So it creates a monopoly, one-stop shop for your lines. And you're seeing that what you just described is happening in Montana. I know people were up in arms right when the first odds came out in Montana, and you see a -137 on both sides of a game. It's like, how much you have to win over time to how many bets you have to win laying -137 over time. So no one can do it. So it's a situation where, even Oregon, they have a similar system where the lottery runs it, and they just have it's just one option. And the governor in Oregon just came out last week, and she's siding with new law, new legislation that's being introduced to change that existing system and actually move to a system where they have multiple private entities, operating. So you're seeing a state already in that example that's kind of realized, hey, we did not get this right, so let's change. So hopefully New York can look there for a prime example of why that the system that Cuomo is talking about is just not going to work for them in the long term.
Yeah, it sounds like naturally a lot of growing pains with this as different states try to figure it out, but at least it's encouraging to see a place like Oregon um, to try to get it right instead of severally try to be right if they clearly are not with the initial approach. So a lot of ebbs and flows to all this. I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you as often as we can get you on the show to stay abreast of everything going on the legalization front.
Yeah. And it's all in the numbers too. I mean, like when you look at the state, I mean, the proof is in the pudding when you see the state revenue numbers, which obviously they all publish. So you could see the states that are bringing more money are the ones that have that system in place, and the states that are falling behind and not bringing in anywhere near as much revenue are the states that have, a similar system like Washington, D.C. or Montana, Oregon, and, even New Hampshire. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, on the topic of bringing in the revenue, if you were a Bucks bettor on Sunday, things panned out pretty well. Transitioning into some NFL talk, looking at Conference Championship Sunday that we just experienced 2 days ago as we record this conversation, episode to drop a little bit later in the week. But nevertheless, we know what happened at Lambeau Field on Sunday, the Bucks beating the Packers. Having watched that game, thinking about it from what transpired on Sunday and what this could mean for the Bucks in the Super Bowl, what would your top takeaway be from the NFC title game?
For me, I mean, it's the Brady factor, and I hate to sound square talking about this, but literally just his swag level. You could just see him making those throws with confidence during that game when he was zipping it through. A couple of them got picked. He threw a couple of them in the red zone.
3.
But yeah. So, but he was the fact that he was throwing them with the same confidence and with authority, he put zest on those. And a couple of those balls were catchable. I think that one of them, Mike Evans, kind of sailed through his hands and stuff. So not totally on Brady for that. But I think there's something to be said that it's really hard to quantify. When we're trying to find edges on a weekly basis in the NFL. But there's something to be said for that Tom Brady factor and him lifting up the other players around him who know that he's been there for forever. He's a mainstay. I mean, how many Super Bowls has he played in now? Like 9 or 10.
I think this will be his 10th.
Yeah. So his presence and experience, I think, just lifts up the confidence level of the other players and even the coaches that are calling the plays. Maybe they're more willing to call. And you know how Bruce Arians is with his offense. I mean, but more willing to call play that, hey, guy like Tom Brady, he can make this throw. He's not worried. So it could even impact, things like that in the play calling. So that's my biggest takeaways is Tom Brady. And I'll be honest, not to toot my own horn here at all, because nobody cares about bets that other people have, but I was a big believer in the Bucks before they signed Brady, because even when they brought in Bruce Arians, I was like, okay, this is good. I'm a big Bruce Arians fan. And so I locked in like a few futures on the Bucks before Brady back in March, before he signed with the team at 40 to 1, 50 to 1, and 20 to 1 to win the NFC. So I was definitely rooting for the Bucks this weekend. And then of course, when they brought in Brady, the market, all the betting public sided with the Bucks. I think they got down to like 10 to 1, 12 to 1, and all the value was sucked away to the point where I think there was actually probably even betting value on the under in their season win total by the time it closed at like 10 or 10 and a half. So, I think the betting market, at the start of the season completely, they've made the Bucks a public team, so to speak, but I think it was warranted. I mean, maybe it's a square thing to think, and maybe it's confirmation bias, but I think that a guy like Tom Brady, you just can't quantify that extra X factor that he brings to the table.
Yeah, and one topic that came up, I'm sure, with a lot of bettors last weekend, having futures tickets on any of the Final Four teams standing, would be whether or not to hedge. And with your Bucks futures exposure, I know you're generally aligned with my point of view on this. I spoke to it at length in last week's episode, which hedging essentially makes sense in 2 cases. Either it's guaranteeing life-changing money, or that bet that is essentially a hedge would have standalone value. What was your approach to handling the Bucks heading into Green Bay as an underdog last Sunday?
Yeah, no, that was exactly. I mean, I completely agree with the way you said that, and it's a different situation for every bettor when they're thinking. There's that trade off when you're hedging. How much hedging do you want to do? How much EV do you want to give away? And for me, I did play back some on the Packers. I found like a nice money line price that was, I think it was like minus 160 when the market was, consensus was like minus 175. So I played a little bit back on Green Bay on the money line just to more or less. I mean, not to like think that I've locked in a profit or anything like that, but more your second example of a little bit of betting value, even though I've made the game pretty much right what it was at. The going rate actually leaned the Bucks a little bit, but yeah, so I play back a little bit. Of course, not wishing I didn't, but that was for I had the NFC future. I think if it was a situation where if I didn't have the NFC future and just like that game was the game in question, I probably wouldn't have hedged as much, if at all, just because obviously I have to win one more game to cash the 50-1 tickets. But yeah, I did hedge a little bit.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is militant as I like to be with that type of approach, knowing what the numbers say. At a certain point, if it's just emotionally irresistible or not hedging would take some of the joy out of it, there's also that dynamic. Like something is not necessarily minus EV, even if the numbers would say it, if it means that mentally you're going to be in a better place. So to your point, that's a different equation for every bettor.
Right, and everybody has a different risk tolerance, and let's face it. I mean, it's like everyone's. I guess like a big payout is different to different people and stuff too. So it really comes down to how much you're willing to live with. And you kind of brought that point up just now. It's how much if you can live with yourself, I guess. And I would have been totally fine if I didn't hedge and the Bucks didn't win. But of course I say that at the same time. So right now, so
Yeah.
it's easy to say in these shoes right now. But for me, it's always a situation where I'm avoiding at all costs giving away my equity when I have it.
Yeah, and I think a big point there is just being mindful of the trade-off. Clearly, you had a plan, you found a number that was, off market and advantageous for the other side. So there was some of that standalone value. And yeah, moving forward to the Super Bowl, still a lot of futures on the Bucks, probably fewer on the Chiefs because they've been a shorter number all along. But that's something that people can keep in mind over the next couple of weeks. If you're going to hedge, like that's okay. That doesn't make you a terrible bettor or a bad person or anything like that. But just be mindful of the trade-offs. If you're making a bet that doesn't have positive expected value on its own, then that is something to factor into the decision-making process.
Exactly. Like in a vacuum on its own, if it's a bad bet, you shouldn't be making it. But in a vacuum, if it's plus EV, then it's a bet you should be making. And obviously that's hard to find and stuff. But this situation, I completely agree. So it's going to be an interesting thing for a lot of bettors this in the next couple of weeks. The temptation will probably be there to lock in a profit, but they just have to know when they do that you're effectively dipping into the VIG twice, because as we know, futures pools, when you're betting into those, the household is a lot higher than a lot of bettors even realize, and then obviously you're going to be laying that minus 110 when you're hedging, or in theory, if you're laying a money line, you're going to be betting into the household. So bettors should be aware of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you laid out your primary takeaway from the NFC title game pretty well. When I first heard that, I was tempted to disagree quite a bit because having had a few derivatives on the Packers skewed toward a strong start, that clearly did not play out well. And the end of the first half was just a backbreaker. I think one of the passes before the touchdown, when the Packers just decided not to play defense, they had an interception, just an easy pick that they dropped. So that I think Brady threw 3 picks in the second half. He should have had another one before halftime instead of a touchdown that really skewed his box score. But at the same time, he's exceeded all of my expectations. So I can't push back too hard, having bet Tampa Bay regular season wins under at multiple numbers. So I do have to acknowledge that, they might have got some good breaks, but they've still done a lot to earn their current place. So tying that in with my biggest takeaway from the NFC title game, I just watching it, I could not stop questioning the process behind the fortunate results that the Bucks seem to be getting. And I'm not looking to bet against them in the Super Bowl because of it, but thinking about first downs, just before every first down snap, it's like, okay, here's going to be a run for 0 to 3 yards. They were way too predictable. I did some manual charting and they ran it on 14 out of 21 first down snaps. And that's filtering out that inexplicable final play of the first half when everybody except for the Packers knew they were going to pass.
Except Greg Williams took over as a coach for a play for the Packers too.
Exactly. Yeah. He's got a dozen head coaching offers waiting for him, but he had to step in for that moment for Green Bay at the coordinator level.
Yeah, dude, just for that play.
So, yeah, there was that moment where that's, of course they were going to pass there. And the last series of downs when they're running out the clock after they got the final first down on a pass interference call, we knew they were going to run. So in more or less situations where they could have been less predictable. They still ran 2/3 of the time, and yet they converted 2/3 of the time on 3rd and 4th down in the game. And those conversions included 7 yards, 9 yards, 9 yards, 13 yards. That's
Unsustainable.
just not sustainable. So I know you touched on Bruce Arians, presumably the angle of liking to be aggressive with the offense, and Brady playing at such a high level and the weapons they have in the passing game. Why they're not using that before it's 3rd and long, I don't understand. It worked out for them more often than not on Sunday at Lambeau. But if they're not playing from ahead of the, if they're not making more optimal decisions on early downs, it could really come back to bite them on later downs. So we'll see if they can adjust there. The Packers essentially gave Tampa 2 touchdowns in less than 2 minutes of game time by not defending the final play of the first half. Then there was the Aaron Jones fumble to set up a 1-play, 8-yard touchdown drive in the opening moments of the second half. And then in the end game, so many vagaries. The Matt LaFleur decision to kick the field goal, chief among them, but that was far from the only one. Tampa Bay's kick returner sliding down on his own volition with 2 seconds to go before the 2-minute warning. That just gave the Packers a 4th timeout. The Packers wisely jumping offside after the 2-minute warning because it was going to be 2nd and 2. Just give them the first down and save your timeouts for a fresh series of downs. Arians could have declined that penalty, and he didn't do it. I've played in flag football leagues where people know to decline that penalty in that situation. So,
I was livid. I was not happy.
so Tampa Bay won the game, and they deserve credit, but LaFleur wasn't the only one to make a questionable decision, but the Bucs did get some breaks. And I have to note that LaFleur's post-game comments lamenting the result, but defending his process to kick that field goal. To me, that's just an affront to any sense of reason. And I know better than to take it personally or try to read too much into it. But as somebody who champions the process over the result, hearing him twist things around like that was just like nails on a chalkboard. So in that sense, I am a little bit relieved that it's Tampa that's going to be playing in the Super Bowl to represent the NFC. Got to give them credit. As many breaks as they might have gotten, as much questionable process as they might have overcome. Bottom line, to your point, Brady, I think exceeding any reasonable expectations people could have had for them this season. I mean, they're in the Super Bowl. You can only get so many breaks. At a certain point, you have to get the job done to make it this far, and they've done that. So examining the process to get there, maybe not as kind as taking the result of NFC champions at face value, but here they are. They're still Super Bowl bound.
I have a question for you, though, because I think there's something to this potentially. I don't want to hear your thoughts. That late bye week for the Bucs back at, I think, week 13 was their bye week. And obviously, they had a few more weeks left. They had to play week 17. They had to, I think they needed like a result in order to keep that favorable matchup against Washington football team. But do you think that had something to do with maybe this late surge that we're seeing from the Bucs as well? That especially with a guy like Tom Brady, who a little bit older, but having that late bye week allowed some of the guys who had lingering injuries to rest up for the stretch run. Do you think there's something to that, or do you think that might be overblown?
Yeah, it's tough. I can't say with confidence that it isn't helping. If anything, it could only be a boon, especially because Brady at this stage of his career coming in to a new team, definitely a new scheme with no real offseason. I know he was more aggressive than most at trying to do what he could in the offseason, and maybe that's paid off. But getting that late season bye, it seems like all reports from people closer to the Bucs who watch them more than I do seem to think that the timing with the receivers has been noticeably better since then. And also, I think that comes into play when considering Tampa was playing its 5th road game in 6 weeks in the NFC title game. Green Bay had only traveled once in those past 6 weeks. So that's a daunting situation anytime you stack it up, but having that late season bye at least might have given the Bucs a little more freshness than a team that, let's say, in that same spot running on fumes if they had a week 4 bye. So,
and especially in COVID too, I think something to be said for that, really helping out. Just it's harder to travel during COVID and with everything in place right now, a lot more stress involved with traveling. And I thought that helped them personally, but it's hard to say how much,
Yeah, that's one of those things that's almost impossible to quantify. And generally a lot of narratives are, easy to get out of hand. I like to think something I'll touch on later, if you're hearing about something on ESPN or at the barber shop, then it's probably baked into the line and then some. So yeah, from a betting standpoint, maybe there's not a ton to take from it, but from just a pure watching football, seeing how this team is performing, it's hard to say that that's hurt in any way. It's only something that could be working in their favor.
Yeah,
and here they are with another bye, so we'll see what they can do against Andy Reid off a bye. And on that note, transitioning to the AFC, what was your top takeaway from the AFC Championship game between the Bills and the Chiefs?
Patrick Mahomes. Honestly, like my biggest takeaway from that game was, and it sounds, might be square again, but just Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelsey. How do you guard that if you're a defensive coordinator, even when you have 2 weeks to prepare for that? When you have a guy like Mahomes, that's going to be like really hard to stop, especially in today's NFL. So my takeaway, I guess, from that was just more of the same from the Chiefs. But I was also thinking, like, how are the Bucks going to scheme this up for the next 2 weeks? Because you can only do so much. You can only double team two guys so much and leave yourself exposed to a guy like Patrick Mahomes. So yeah, it was might be square, but just the Chiefs are really good was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, well, and it's funny going into that game, the narrative was they haven't covered a game for 2 months, and
Yeah.
they still suffering from the Super Bowl championship hangover? Are they able to flip the switch? And now the narrative is, geez, they've only lost one game since before the playoffs began last year. It's amazing how that can turn on a dime. Again, beware the power of narratives, but especially Mahomes in that setting. I think by the time we got to the middle of the week, it seemed pretty likely that the concussion protocol element wouldn't have a huge effect if he even did have a concussion. People more knowledgeable than I can speak to that part of the injury situation, but the turf toe, his mobility seemed really good. And with another bye coming up, um, after he looked noticeably hobbled on a few pretty straightforward pass attempts against the Browns, he didn't run a lot, but when he needed to maneuver in the pocket and keep plays alive, he was totally able to do it. And with a bye week before the Super Bowl, it's a safe bet he'll be able to do it again on Super Sunday. So to your point, the Bucks defense has its work cut out for it, and good luck if Todd Bowles wants to stay blitz heavy like he always is. They might need to adapt if they're going to have any chance there.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. But 2 weeks prepare for it. That's at least they have that.
Yeah, that's not going to hurt if they can make as good of use with this bye week as they did with their later bye week in the regular season. Then Tampa Bay, definitely has a chance in this one. And I'll say that from the AFC Championship game, my top takeaway was Sean McDermott. Like, what's going on, man? Good head coach by all accounts, but holy smokes! 13 seconds left in the first half, down 21-9, 4th and goal at the 2, kicking a field goal. Just like the Packers 4th down at the end of the game in Lambeau, that was an automatic go for it decision. Instead, kicks a 20-yard field goal to keep a two-score game going into halftime. And if that wasn't enough, he doubled down on that approach late third quarter, almost the same exact spot. Again, down by 12, 4th and 3 in the red zone, kicks a 26-yard field goal once again to cut a two-score deficit to a two-score deficit. So that's textbook on how not to beat the Chiefs. And the bottom line is that the Chiefs, to your point, they're tough enough to beat when you don't double down on suboptimal decisions, especially with Mahomes looking dangerously close to 100%, and he may well be there come Super Sunday. So Kansas City didn't need any favors to get back to the Super Bowl, but I'm sure they were happy to take a couple assists from a pretty highly regarded head coach in Sean McDermott.
Yeah, I think it's just something to be said. Like coaches in the playoffs, and it's not just this year, but they just get so risk averse with their decision making. And I don't know if it's the added pressure of the moment and with more eyeballs on them, what really gets into their heads here. But yeah, it's perplexing to say the least. Seeing these coaches that have spent the whole year. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's finalist for Coach of the Year this year, and to make decisions like that after making decisions, pretty optimally the whole season. I can't think of any off the top of my head that he made during the regular season or even in the playoffs so far up until this week that were head scratchers. But then he comes out with those, so not ideal.
Yeah, well, speaking of risk aversion, I guess the flip side of that could speak to a lot of bettors' approaches when it comes to the Super Bowl. I know it's the biggest game of the year, a lot of different ways to get down and have some action riding on it. But as we look ahead to Super Sunday, if you could share one tip for betting on the Super Bowl, what would you say?
Oh man, I might do a 3-pack here, but I'll make it quick. First tip, and I'm sorry if I'm stealing one of yours, but like I didn't want to be just like the guy who's no fun to let you know, and I'm sure you would echo this sentiment, but it's just the same. Like your bankroll does not understand the difference between the Super Bowl and a Wednesday night, Missouri Valley college basketball game. The money prints the exact same, and when you're betting into a Super Bowl line, especially on the same on game day, you're betting into a line that's been hammered out by the public, and and it's one of the most liquid. It is the most liquid betting market effectively here in regulated betting in the U.S. So understand that going in, but also when you're looking to bet props, because we're all going to have prop bets, handicap the game first. Handicap how you think the game is going to play out, and then go from there. So take the bigger picture view. If you think it's going to be more of a high scoring game, then and you're looking to bet the over, and obviously you're going to want to do the same with a lot of props too. There's a correlation there. So handicap the game first before looking to bet your props, so then you can kind of formulate how you think the game's going to go and bet from there. And then the last thing that I love bringing up to people, it's that Super Bowl phenomenon. We don't see it in that many games ever throughout the course of a year, but you see the phenomenon where the money line favorite phenomenon, and right before kickoff, it's kind of the tendency of the betting public to not want to. Your average bettor doesn't want to bet a lot to win a little, so they're not going to really want to bet a favorite. Lay the minus 170, bet $170 to win 100. The average bettor is more likely to want to bet the 100 to win 170. So as such, people want to bet, most people want to bet the money line on the underdog. And oftentimes in the Super Bowl, that opens up value on the favorite on the money line right at kickoff. And, when you see a situation where the spread does not correlate to the money line in the same way that you would expect. And there's some good resources out there to see what money line you would expect based off a certain point spread in the NFL. I know SBR, Sportsbook Review, they do an odds conversion tool. You probably Google SBR odds converter, and that'll help you convert spreads to money line, so you can see what the money line should be based off the point spread. And you almost always see in the Super Bowl, especially a tighter point spread like this one, we're seeing 3.5 points. You'll see a little tick of value on the money line and the favorite right before kickoff. So if you're looking to bet the dog on the money line, do it sooner. If you're looking to bet on the favorite on the money line, wait till right before kickoff.
Yeah, and to that last point, I'm looking at SBR's odd screen right now, and I'm seeing money lines of minus 170 to minus 175 for the most part on Kansas City. And at this point, that's about in line with what we would typically see from a favorite in their range, a juicy 3 or a cheap 3.5. And there's no reason to lay that money line on Kansas City right now, because there will quite possibly be a flood of Bucks money line bets coming in over the next week and a half. And then right before kickoff, what is now 170 might be somewhere in the 150s, well below where it should be. I know it didn't work out in the NFC title game, but kind of to your point, snagging the Packers for 15 cents less than the market price, routinely you can do that with favorites on the Super Bowl money line.
Yeah, and that applies to some other bigger, higher liquidity markets. So the same phenomenon can take place, in the college football playoff national championship game. You sometimes see it, and even in the the conference championship games in the NFL. But the Super Bowl, it's pretty, it's safe to say that a lot of books are gonna, especially the books that attract more tickets and more square action, I guess you're gonna have that money line value on the Chiefs if that's the way you're looking to bet. So yeah, I agree. I think a minus 150 is totally in the cards on big Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah, well, one thing to follow up on a point you brought up, then I'll get into my biggest tip, which will also have some overlap. So I'll shed some of my own, hopefully unique context to it. But you touched on the notion of betting props in line with how you envision the full game playing out. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. You obviously don't want to make too many bets with an inverse correlation, or you could just be, laying extra vig on top of extra vig, and that usually won't have the desired result. And at the same time, inevitably there are a lot of people out there who will be betting aside, betting a total, even if those lines are very efficiently priced by the market. And then if they're also betting a lot of props, I think it begs the question of unit sizing and making sure that you're not maybe too gung-ho on one path for the game to play out. Because if you envision one path and that's not the case, instead of losing one bet, you could lose upwards of a dozen for a lot of people with a prop betting portfolio. So how do you balance the notion of, I think that's a valid point, leaning toward approaching props the way you would a full game handicap while also keeping exposure in check?
Right. No, that's definitely a tough thing to do, because like you said, if it goes awry, if you're betting all unders and stuff, and then you get that kick return touchdown to start things out, and then it just creates a game flow where there's a team playing from behind and the offenses are a little more quick to move, that can ruin a lot of bets for you. So no, it's an interesting I guess like notion to think about. It's also an interesting just discussion from like a from a theory standpoint, if you're going to look to just bet the way your game handicap shakes out. I mean, sometimes I think you could find obviously market mispricings that can lead to some more bets as well. And that's a lot of the betting I do for prop bets is, you look to even scalp some prices because every book's liability is different. Books are hanging different prices and stuff. So, it's good to, I think, diversify but also, hedge more or less in some ways too. Like, if you're looking to bet, maybe look to bet no special teams defensive touchdown, or sorry, maybe look to bet a yes on defensive special teams touchdown as a sort of hedge. So there's different strategies you could take, I guess, to hedge or more or less put yourself in a situation where you can not find all of your tickets as graded losers and actually, win a few of them, even if the game totally doesn't go the way you expected it to.
Yeah, I like the example of that last bet that you brought up. Most years, I would be looking to bet against there being a defense or special teams touchdown, but sometimes there could be cases where, based on a line a book has or how you think a game will play out, it could make sense to bet the other way. But that's the type of bet that's less contingent on how the game will play out according to a handicap on the side or to a degree the total. Bets like, if you can get a good price closer to kickoff on no overtime, 10-1 or better, no safety, same thing. A team to score 3 straight times, that might feel correlated to the over, but regardless, unless there's a really low total, that's probably a more likely bet than people think. The more or less the official prop bet of props and hops, shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards, and that is contingent on a certain game handicap. So there are a lot of, yes, if you like the Chiefs, then you're probably not going to want to bet Tyreek Hill receiving yards to go under. If you like Tampa Bay, then you'll probably want to look at Brady MVP or, Gronk to score a touchdown, things like that. But a lot of bets that aren't contingent on a team's performance can also offer value that, can neutralize some of the exposure on any one way for the game to play out. And then whatever happens with the total and the side, you can still have some good edges in play. So wanted to touch on that angle, as well as the fact that bankroll management can become a bigger factor. If you do have a lot of prop bets you like that seem tightly correlated to a side that you're betting, I've mentioned this several times on props and hops throughout the year, but not all bet types should have the same unit sizes. So if I say I'm betting 1 unit on a teaser and 1 unit on a prop, those are not the same, dollar amounts. I tend to bet more on teasers, especially if you can find, one that fits the Wong model, crossing through 3 and 7 for -110. That's the jackpot. Point spreads versus team totals. Again, like every type of bet as you feel out your own process should probably have a different raw dollar amount attached to the unit size. So if somebody's $100 better and that's what they bet on the Chiefs, don't also bet $100 on Mahomes to go over his touchdown total and Kelsey to go over his receiving yards total and Clyde Edwards-Helaire to go over his receiving yards. That could be the best betting day of your life, or it could be your undoing. So there are other ways to get at it that don't have you as exposed to one specific path. And if you do really like one specific path, there are ways to get at it with bankroll management that still, leave you, somewhat protected from an exposure standpoint. So even the worst case game flow doesn't lead to the worst hangover the next day, unless you just had too many beers during the game.
Right. That's why you should be hungover the next day, not because of any other reason. So no, I agree with all of that completely, because you don't want to, just harkening back to what I said at the start, it's one game and literally the money does not know the difference and stuff. And obviously everyone feels compelled. It's human nature. You want to have more money on the game, and so many people will have money on this game in some form. But you just have to remember it's just one event. And there are tons of college basketball games on the betting board the very next day and all during the week. And there's another football season that's going to come. And there's a lot more things to bet on. So just remembering that it's just one event, one game, and anything can happen. As we know, the vagaries of sports betting, anything is possible in this art. So being prepared accordingly and staking accordingly.
Yeah, and to that point, well, I'll mention my one tip for betting the Super Bowl. Then we'll move on to what we promise is part of this conversation as we get pretty deep into the episode and talk about how to win at sports betting from a bigger picture with some more evergreen angles. But one more point on my end when it comes to betting the Super Bowl, aligns with a lot of what you said. It's the biggest game of the year, but that does not mean it's time for the biggest bet of the year. I have to remind myself of that as the excitement builds every year at about this time. And I feel compelled to give everybody else that same friendly reminder, especially considering that we're looking at an awfully efficient market here. I mean, the point spread in total were pretty well hammered into place before the AFC title game was even over. So just keep that in mind when you have one game of this magnitude. There are some awfully sharp people with a lot of money in play. So being disciplined there, that can be your best friend. And on the topic of discipline, I draw a parallel to how I approached the AFC Championship game. I was looking at lines and ready to fire on the Bills at +3.5 for a flat -110 if we would see it. And it came awfully close a few times. There were some +3.5s at -115, so just a tick away. Also some +3s at +105, and at +110, that +3 would have been a go because the favorable vig would have been worth forfeiting the hook in that case. Ultimately, those numbers just quite didn't show up. So I ended up passing on the game and felt silly early on. The Bills jumped out to a 9-0 lead, but ultimately it was another valuable reminder that passing on a bet that ultimately loses holds more inherent value than forcing the hand on a winning bet. Because once we factor in the vig, if you go 50-50 in those scenarios, you're paying out the vig, and that's a good way to bleed some bankroll in the long run. So dodged a bullet there just by trying to figure out what I thought the absolute floor was for a price on the Bills, and it got awfully close. But if it doesn't get there, you don't have to bet it.
It's better to not lose 110 than it is to win 100. So and in your case, it was better to not lose 115 than to win 100 in that regard. So yep, 100%.
Yeah. So, and there, not to be a wet blanket on this, there are still plenty of bets worth making. As we kind of touched on earlier, the prop market, it's the best prop market of the year. Much more to come on props in next week's episode of this show, and most likely on the Doggy Juice pod as well. In general, when it comes to props, laying the vig can be scary, but that is often the way to go. To your point, a lot of people like to bet a little to win a lot, and the public influence in this market can open up some pretty good windows. A lot of good numbers on props are there because they don't charge as much vig as they should, even if there's a big minus number, attached to that line, especially after the public has had time to enter the market. Again, betting a little to win a lot time after time, we can see a lot of windows open up in that final 24 to 48 hours before kickoff. So there is plenty of fun to be had with the Super Bowl as a bettor, but oftentimes we're working with smaller edges in such an efficient market, and that does sometimes call for smaller bets.
Yeah. Yes, could not have said it better. And I feel like along those lines of props, like I'll bet a lot of props right when they're posted, but then usually I'm not betting a lot of props in that interim period, and then a lot more that last 24 to 48 hours for the same reasons you said. Because the public money comes in, and there's certain bets I find myself making every single year, like the one you mentioned. Will there be 3 consecutive scores? Public sees that plus money, and they want to bet a certain side. It always opens up value on the yes, and no overtime. There's some other props where every year I'm laying a pretty heavy price, but to your point, I should be laying more. So it's something I'm willing to do.
Yeah. Sounds like a good way to wrap up the initial approach to Super Bowl betting. I know we'll be doing a lot more digging into things over the next week plus, and sharing more in our final episodes before that game kicks off. But for now, we can transition. Now that we've been talking for almost an hour about the billing for this episode, how to win at sports betting. And what we'll do here is we will count down each of our top 5 recommendations that we've put together independently. So we'll count down from 5 to 1. And the rankings might be a little arbitrary, but figure there's nothing wrong with a little dramatic effect here. And one caveat off the top, this is not intended to be all encompassing. There are way more than 5 ways to win, or 5 things that somebody should pay attention to maximize their winnings as a bettor in the long run. And also the paths to winning evolve over time as games and markets evolve. So this is something that would possibly be great to revisit in the future. But for now, we're just trying to make this more of a solid foundation than a finished product. So with that in mind, Mike, what is your number 5 tip to winning at sports betting?
So my number 5 tip, it's going to be one that a lot of bettors don't want to hear, especially newer bettors. Avoid parlays. Avoid betting parlays, even if it's at all costs, just if you have to shut them down completely. There are exceptions, of course, to every single rule, but the household is just too big in parlays. And it kind of goes back to that, what we were talking about, that lottery mentality, the bet a little to win a lot, that lotto angle that a lot of bettors are gravitate towards. And I've heard friends tell me, you could take parlays away from my cold dead hands. I'll always bet them no matter what, no matter how much you tell me they're a bad bet. But the temptation's there, but for the bigger payout. But every single time you're not getting the payout that you should be. Almost always, can't see it definitively, because as we know, there's correlated parlays and situations where parlays actually do fit. But as a whole, your general rule, just avoid them completely and stick to straight bets.
Yeah, I think to that end, I mean, we were talking about the way the NFC title game ended when Matt LaFleur sent the field goal unit onto the field. The Bucs sideline must have been celebrating inside, and most of the time, if you're betting a parlay, that ticket writer on the other side of the counter is probably celebrating inside. So just think about it from the stance of, if you're making a bet that they're eager to take from you, then it might be best to look in a different direction.
Exactly. Yes. Books make most of their margin off parlays too. And if you want an example, look at how Barstool did in Pennsylvania last month.
Yeah. Yeah, well, instead of looking at Barstool's Pennsylvania's numbers from last month for now, I will share my number 5, and that would be, thinking about it from a high level, start with a goal. And this is less specific to a certain return on investment or breaking even or only losing X amount of dollars, because the bottom line is that most bettors do lose in the long run, and that's okay as long as you're not losing more than you can afford to. But for me, the goal is more about having it being identity driven. So to be clear, again, there's nothing wrong with numbers based goals. Certainly important to have a clear cap on how much you can afford to lose. But even with the best handicap, the result of any one bet can be so far beyond our control. And I think that magnifies the importance of not focusing on any particular result, but more about the process behind the result and ultimately the identity that you're working toward. And to give an example of this to maybe lend some clarity, my goal is to approach betting like a professional. And I know I'm an amateur bettor. I don't make a living doing this. I do like to think that I'm better at it than most people, but having the goal of approaching it like a pro provides a direction to move in. And the better I do that, the better those results that are numbers driven will be in the long run. And in the meantime, I'm not living and dying by every result. So long-term bettors, it's important to remember, long-term winning bettors have droughts, and that comes with the territory. Even the best will have losing days, weeks, months, and years. I think when you have a winning day, week, month, or year, it doesn't mean you've really figured everything out. And when you hit a rough patch, it doesn't mean you're worthless and you can't rebound. A good season isn't a finish line, and a bad season is not an indictment on your ability, because ultimately, tying this in with having a goal framed around the identity you want to adopt, your ability as a bettor is not determined by recent results as much as it is by your approach and how that approach fuels the identity that you're working toward in the long run.
And that's, I mean, case in point, you're holding off that Bills play last week with the, instead of taking the 3.5 of that, or minus 115, you're holding off for that minus 110. That was what a pro would do. And you stayed off just for that one game and ended up working out.
Yeah, I mean, if they had kept that lead that they jumped out to, I might have felt it a little differently. But again, it's nice when process and outcome are not contradicting concepts. So I'll take it. That was a fortuitous pass. So, all right, moving on. What is your number 4 tip?
Number 4, this is another do not, and I think that this will be my last do not, because I don't want to be totally a no fun guy, but do not buy points, with rare exceptions, of course. I'll get into those right now, but along those lines, remember also that teasers are the same thing. As teasers are the same as buying points. So when you're teasing, you're effectively buying points. There's obviously exceptions to that too, as we know the Stanford Wong model, especially in NFL games with lower totals, that increases the relative value of every point that you're teasing through. So that's a nice exception. And there's exceptions to buying points too. I know that there's some books, namely the Canby books here in my home state of Illinois, and that's DraftKings, Bet Rivers. Sometimes you can buy on and off a 3 for less than they should be charging you for. I think the rule of thumb in the NFL these days is on and off a 3 is worth roughly about 20 cents, maybe a tick under. But sometimes in the Canby books, you could buy, from a +3 to +3.5, 9, 12 cents, something like that. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's an exception. I've done that recently too. So yeah, it's possible. So it's not a hardline rule never to buy points. And obviously alternative markets and with alternative totals, alternative point spreads is, you're effectively buying points there too, but you could find nice inefficiencies in the market there too. So it's not like just a black and white rule, but in general, when the temptation's there and when a book's trying to entice you to buy points, you're going to be paying too much for what the point's actually worth buying. And, I think the going, usually it's 10 cents. That's standard, in basketball and football, when it's not onto a key number. It's just not worth that 10 cents. Of course, buying onto key numbers in the NFL changes the equation. And in basketball, with smaller totals, games do tend to land on 2 and 3 quite a bit. 5 is also a relatively key number in basketball, and 7, but it's still not worth a 10-cent buy. Situate, and obviously that changes based off of the total. In a game with a very low total, where the respective value of every point is worth a lot more, you could find more exceptions there as well. But in general, it's just not a good move.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up because there have been a few playoff games in the last couple of weeks that have been hovering, right on or off of the 3. And some books might have a -3, -125. Elsewhere, it's, plus. Let's see. If we've got a -3 at -125, we might have a -3.5 at even money. And it's like, well, I only want to lay 3. I don't want to give up that hook. Well, that hook is worth the 25-cent trade-off you're getting there. But it can be tough to know how that math pans out. So I like that you addressed that, 20 cents is about the ballpark. I think now with the longer PAT, higher scoring, it's, I often say maybe it's about 18 cents, but it's in that range. Clearly, if you're getting a Camby book that'll give it to you for 9 or 12 cents, take it every time. If you're being charged 25 cents for it, it can feel counterintuitive, but it's better to lay, a -3.5 for even money than a -3 for -125, even though if you're just looking at the odds of winning that specific bet, they would go down in the long term. That's well worth it for the ROI because a 3-point favorite doesn't win by 3 in most cases. So when that does happen, you could be kicking yourself for taking the discount, laying the hook, and then it backfires. Instead of a push, you lost. But more often than not, that's not going to be the case. And every time that game doesn't land 3, you get the better end of the deal by not paying the premium.
Exactly. And to piggyback off that, I always, the way for me mentally to kind of to do all this and go through it, is think about over time. So if you're going to make this bet 100 times over a stretch of time, and when you think about it that way, it really helps clear up your mindset and think about it in the proper way, because just one-off event and stuff, and it's easy to get caught up in the, oh man, why didn't I just buy the hook there? And then you're more tempted to pay that 25 cents or whatever is the next time. In reality, think about it. If I made this bet 100 times and it lands on 3, less than 10% of the time in a standard NFL total with a 3 point spread of 3, then you're able to kind of get in the right mindset and process there and say, hey, it's not worth in the long run over those 100 trials buying the 25 cents. So this one-off, don't overreact to it. Think about it. And if I made this bet 100 times, am I going to come out on top more than 53 times at -110 in order to break even or make money?
Yeah, that's a great way to contextualize it. And again, I really like the first couple points you're bringing up because they're immediately applicable to anybody who's looking at lines and how to bet. I think I may have mistakenly taken a bit more of a high level approach, but I love this combination of something that you can, apply to your next bet and something you can think about for the long term. And then both of our approaches will kind of weave in and out of those lanes. But my fourth point would be to exercise discipline. So that kind of ties in with a lot of what we've talked about so far. And specifically my previous point about having a goal, the level of discipline you need will depend on your ambition as a bettor. So there are also different types of discipline involved. It can be how you track your bets, how you watch games, how you plan your time. Are you just going to look at lines on Sunday right before kickoff, or are you trying to get ahead of it as soon as they open, or even beforehand doing some prep? And how you consume media. So when it comes to something like tracking your bets, an example that I would share is teasers and props have been the most profitable types of bets for me this season. And that will probably apply to most seasons. Team totals, I've struggled with. So I can use something like this to analyze results in the offseason and take these findings to inform what approach I want to take in general, and maybe change up the unit sizing for these different types of bets next season. And if you don't track bets or don't reflect on the results once there's a big enough sample size to focus on those results, then you could be missing out on some edges to be gained by adapting. And to be clear, this isn't just about the result of a bet, but also looking at the number you get in relation to the closing number. So in the short term, somebody can lay 3.5 in games that close 3 and go on a hot streak. Somebody could take 3.5 in games that close 3 and go on a cold streak. But in the long term, like you said, if we do this 100, 500, 1,000 times, beating the closing number is going to be the more indicative path of how successful that bettor is going to be. So I think we could at some point maybe do a deep dive exclusively on tracking bets and closing line value. Maybe a good topic for another show down the road. But in the interest of keeping this moving, another area of discipline that I think is crucial is how you watch games. And we all have a natural human tendency to root for our bets. And there's nothing wrong with that. It would be impossible to eliminate that altogether. And frankly, it would take a lot of the joy out of the equation. But with that in mind, I think we can all try to move in the direction of watching games with more of an interest in learning about what we can apply moving forward than dwelling on the result of what we just saw on the last play. Again, the NFC title game, when Green Bay doesn't play defense the last play of the first half, I'm like, okay, I had some derivatives tied to the Packers starting well early. I had the second half outscoring the first half. That was just a gut punch. At the same time, I can say, okay, the box score will show that Tom Brady had a touchdown pass on this drive. So if I wanted to, push back a little more firmly on your first point, he should have thrown a pick a few passes before. That's not going to get reflected, but trying to watch and learn, not to undermine your point about Brady at all, again, exceeding all expectations, but noticing things like that, and trying to be as objective as possible. We're all human. Again, I might have been a little bit too hard on Tampa Bay and not giving them enough credit because I had a vested interest in seeing the Packers perform better there. So it's all about just trying to see what we can learn and not solely focusing on rooting in the bets, even though that's always going to be part of the viewing experience once we've got some action. So there's that. There's the element of how you plan your time, and the discipline that goes into that. David Malinsky had an extraordinary ability to plan his time. He would wake up earlier than pretty much everybody else to get the first crack at the lines. He was fond of saying he liked to get up early because he liked to win. And
Yeah,
I
it's
know
like
that
my favorite quote ever.
it's so simple yet so profound in the same way. And Saturday nights during college football season, he would refer to that as a sacred time. And others could be just relaxing on the weekend, or especially out in Vegas, plenty of options to go party and have a good time. And Dave would be at his place just grinding away, grading games as the results came in so that he's ready to fire when the lines open the next day. And to that point, part of my process for planning my time this season has been focusing on Sunday afternoons and evenings, making sure to tune into the deep dive live stream with Andy Molitor and Drew Dinsick. They do a breakdown of openers as they hit the board for the coming week. And I haven't just played everything they've bet, but they've been so insightful. And I definitely have tailed a few of their plays because they do their work before these lines open. And they often have beaten closing numbers by multiple points, and you've got to snag them quickly. If you're not quick on the trigger, you're not going to get them. And so just making it part of the process to say, hey, I see that these other guys are doing something that's really smart, and they do it at the same time every week. If I want to benefit from it, let me tune in and pay attention to see what I can take away from that process. So often that gap between the Sunday late window ending and Sunday Night Football kicking off, not afraid to shout them out the deep dive, doing their live stream with the openers. There's a lot to be gained, even if you don't bet anything, just to get a head start on forming that approach for the coming week. And then the last thing I'll touch on here is how you consume media. I think that might be the most underrated component of being disciplined as a bettor. I have a friend, Christopher Harris, who hosts a really popular fantasy football podcast, the Harris Fantasy Football Podcast. And he has the phrase click discipline. And I just love it. It just kind of says it all when it comes to how to monitor your behavior when you're, browsing the ESPN app on your phone, or if you have Barstool as a part of your diet, which we could talk about later if that's the case for anybody out there. But trends and narratives are largely just lazy and lacking any predictive value. And something that we touched on earlier, if there's something you're hearing about on ESPN, or again, that barbershop example, then you better believe the guys setting the lines know about it as well. And the people hammering those lines from the moment they open are hyper aware of it. So I think it's important to have a filter and take advantage of any good podcasts or good Twitter follows. There's a lot to be gained when it comes to finding edges from quality info that isn't mainstream, and not letting the mainstream stuff become a time suck for you. Basically, anytime you hear anybody analyze anything, especially if you're tempted to use it to inform a wager, just having the discipline to ask yourself, what are their qualifications for saying this? And do they have an agenda for saying this? So those different areas to apply some discipline can just work wonders over time.
Yeah, where we get our information from is, especially these days, is absolutely key. And especially, in the hot take world of sports betting, obviously, it's easy to throw those narratives around and sound smart and try to, in reality, it's most of it's just noise. So like finding out, and I couldn't agree more with this, like having your process down, where you get your information from could not mean more, because that's informing the way you're thinking too. I mean, we are products of what we spend our time doing. And, so that when you're spending your time consuming a certain media type, or certain, reading a certain article every week, or listening to a certain podcast every week, that's at the expense of other stuff you could be doing with that time. So knowing that, and knowing that your sources of information, is knowing yourself effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, so that I know that was a big one. Touched on, I made that a bit of a four-parter there, but under the umbrella of trying to become as disciplined as possible, a huge component to winning in the long run. So on the heels of that, I'll turn it over to you for your number 3.
So my number 3 is going to go along the lines with that in a big way, but it's embracing variance. Embrace variance, and along those lines, do not tilt, and beware of certain things that a lot of bettors fall into, especially early bettors, and that's recency bias. Thinking that, hey, I've reeled off 7 winners in a row, even, and like you said, even without CLV, and a lot of, anybody can reel off 7 wins in a row. Anybody could flip a coin, 7 times and get 7 heads in a row. It's not going to happen often, but it does happen. And in sports betting, especially if you're planning on doing this in the long run, the law of large numbers does come into play. And with that, you're going to invariably, it doesn't matter. You're going to have long stretches of losing and long stretches of winning. It comes with the territory doing this, and being able to react accordingly and not overreact is key. And a lot of bettors get burned by this. They think, even gambler's fallacy, like do theory. They think, hey, I've lost my last 5 bets, so let's bet a little more on the 6th one because I'm more likely to win it. In reality, you are just as likely to win it as any of the other bets. If anything, maybe there's something in your process that you're not taking into account properly, and you should be betting less and holding yourself back. So a lot of people get stuck on this, and you just have to accept that the tough times are going to come with betting. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It goes along with the whole parlay thing that I said in my rule number 5 for me. If you're looking to bet a little to win a lot, it's probably not going to happen. Some people do hit those parlays, those big monster parlays and those lotto tickets. But most of us, the only way to win, and I know you agree with this, is by slowly over time just assembling a portfolio every day with betting. That's assembled with small edges, because it's really rare to find a game where you're getting more than 5 or 10% of betting edge. And so just assembling a portfolio every day filled with small edges, building up your bankroll over time is the way to do it, and not get caught up in the short-term noise. So embrace the variance. It's going to happen. Of those, just always think in that mindset of, making this bet 100 times or 1,000 times, because if you're thinking that way, your process is going to be right for all 100 or all 1,000. And you're not going to find yourself in a situation where you're just reacting to a small patch of, a very small sample size.
Yeah, I love that. Once in a while, I'll see somebody on Twitter hyping themselves for having a 2-in-1 day. And then like, cool. Like you flip a coin 3 times and you're going to get the same result at least twice a good chunk of the time. So yeah, variance is definitely a big part of what we're doing. And I think my number 3, I phrased it differently, but there's a lot in common there. And my number 3 tip is to keep an open mind. To the point of variance, if you're backing your opinion with money, then that's inviting being proven wrong all the time. But that's okay, because you don't have to be right all the time. You just have to be right a small fraction of the time more than others in the market.
Is the holy grail, yeah.
Yeah. And betting markets, they do tend to evolve when it comes to, getting more efficient over time. And if we're too stubborn to evolve, then we'll get left behind, or our bankrolls are going to get depleted. So keeping an open mind is key. And an example that comes to mind to this point would be just looking at, let's say, the Packers for the calendar year or the last 8 to 9 months. Going back to April, they were universally panned for their draft. And look how they did this season. And that doesn't mean that their draft was good. The critics of their draft may well be right in the long term, but the intense reaction to their draft skewed the perception heavily for the short-term future of the team. And I think drafts and coaching hires often take years to grade with any basis in reality. Kind of touched on this last week in the Malinsky Minute on a rant about some of the reactions to the Chargers head coaching hire. And I know it's popular to give hot takes and instant analysis, but similar to the importance of having, media discipline that we touched on earlier, keeping that stuff, hot takes, instant analysis, keeping that at a distance is probably your best ticket to having a more open mind. It's okay to have an initial reaction. I mean, we're human, but it's important to keep it in check and know the difference between a gut reaction and an intense reaction, and try to work in the direction of being open to having your mind changed. I know I had to do that this year, specifically holding myself accountable for how I perceived Josh Allen. I'm not alone in this, but I was wrong about him. And I was down on the Bills before the season because of Allen's accuracy issues. And even early on in the season, he got off to a hot start. He's going to be, up there when the MVP voting is revealed, and deservedly so. But after a hot start, he stumbled a bit. And I doubled down against Allen right before the Cardinals game, saying, oh, that hot start was a mirage. And now it's back to the same old guy we've already seen for 2 seasons. But between that Cardinals game, the Hail Murray, and between that and the AFC title game, the Bills didn't lose. And a big part of that is because Allen was outstanding for the majority of the time. So I need to acknowledge that I was wrong with how I expected him to play heading into the season. He played like a star for most of the season. And it's okay to be slow to change your mind sometimes. I think reacting to one strong week might have been a bit too much of a knee-jerk reaction. So I did need him to see it. I needed him to see that do it quite a bit more than once, it turns out. I was a bit too slow to change there, but I did realize I needed to change my mind and upgrade the Bills accordingly. I mean, historically, his turnaround in terms of accuracy 3 years into a pro career is unprecedented. So there's a lot of reason to doubt the reality of it 1, 2, or 3 games into the season. But at a certain point, when things like this happen, and surprising things do happen all the time, again, to your point about variance, we have to evolve and acknowledge these things when they change and just appreciate them for what they are.
Yes, could not agree more. It's the best bettors that I've encountered over time are able to adjust their sales, and just keep your ship going, but adjust your sales accordingly. And sometimes that's changing your opinion on a player or a team, or changing a rating. Maybe you're reluctant to change, or adjusting your weighting on something. There's a lot of different ways to go about that. And also another thing about the variance that I wanted to bring up is something like this. I heard this like a couple years ago, and it really helped kind of clear my mind on this, because, and especially, in the face of a long losing streak where, I'll see friends who are not spending the same hours or even close to it, touting their wins recently. When you're trying to win in the long run, doing this seriously and laying -110, you're really just trying to win one more bet out of every 20 than a random person who's just flipping coins who knows nothing. So like, like someone's grandma flipping coins, just one more win in 20 you expect over time, and that's what you're shooting for, and that's to hit 55% versus 50. And so thinking about it that way, just it helps you kind of put you at ease and able to get through those inevitable tough stretches where you're going to be losing 6 or 7 bets in a row, and it seems like the world's coming apart and everything. So it's just it's a good way to like clear the mindset.
Yeah, a good way to free yourself from depending too much on any one result, and definitely keeping that bigger picture in mind. Exactly. So, yeah. Well, what is your number 2?
I feel like we're gonna have the same last 2, but let's, or maybe in some way. My number 2 is have multiple outs for betting, as I always say that, and I do this on my podcast too. My first episode of my podcast was the 10 commandments of sports betting, and I've said whenever I discuss those that this is the one thing, having multiple outs, that you as a bettor listening to this right now can put into practice right away. It's the one thing you can do without having to study more or trying to dive into team news or try and make some kind of model or algorithm or anything. No, this is the one thing you could put on your side right now, and that's of course funding multiple accounts, but having multiple outs and books with different lines. So obviously if you're in Illinois, you got to be careful you're not if you're where I'm at, don't put your money into only the Canby books, the same operator. We're going to be getting the same odds. Make sure you're getting into books that are offering different lines, different odds providers, because shopping lines is more meaningful than ever before right now, especially with multiple legal options at our disposal here in the United States. But price shopping is everything, and the sports betting is like the stock market. It is all about numbers. It's not teams, it's numbers. And if you are striving to find the absolute best price and reducing the and I know they touched on this in the Logic of Sports Betting book as well, but the synthetic hold, that whole concept, if you reduce the synthetic hold, so like if the market consensus is +3 -110, but you're able to find that 2.5 at minus 115 at one book, you are lowering your synthetic hold. Or even, a better example is just the same number, +3 minus 110 versus +3 minus 105. It's a situation where if you find that minus 105, you have to win that much less in the long term, and striving to find that best number is the difference between winning and losing in the long term. And especially in a spot where you're trying to win one out of every extra 20, like we just talked about. So this is a game of small margins. And when you're trying to win on a daily basis with, a portfolio of just small edges with a bunch of different bets, if you're getting that half point and you're striving to get the best number and laying a little less vig when it's possible, that literally is winning versus losing.
Yeah, I love that example of a +3 at minus 110 or the same number at minus 105. It might seem insignificant. I mean, it's the same number. And to most people, it's like, well, if the game lands on 3, I push. If they win by more than that, I win. If they win by less than that or they lose, I lose. Either way, it's the same number. Who cares? But circling back to something I touched on about having discipline when it comes to grading your bets, an interesting exercise, if anybody has the discipline to do this in the off season, check out what your overall ROI would look like if you add an extra 5 cents of vig to every bet that you made. That could so easily be the difference between losing a little bit and breaking even and winning a little bit and winning a substantial amount. Again, something you've brought up a few times is playing this out over the course of, trying to win one more bet out of every 20, or play out this bet 100 times, not just isolating the focus on this one outcome. Mm-hmm. And those small differences, seemingly small differences in a line, can be all the difference over time. And we're halfway there to having the same final top 2 tips, because mine, different phrasing, but the same concept: shop for the best line you can find. And I think this is the best time of year to speak to that, because again, with Super Bowl props, we're going to see huge discrepancies in lines from book to book. And an example that I benefited from last year was Patrick Mahomes versus Jimmy Garoppolo rushing yards. One book had that matchup prop having Mahomes minus 20.5 rushing yards. And another book I have had Garoppolo plus 30.5. So that opens up a massive middle opportunity. And it looked like Mahomes was going to run away with it, but in glorious fashion, he conceded 15 yards in the final minute of that game to kill some clock. I know that was the undoing of a lot of people who had bets on Mahomes to go over his rushing total. You definitely got the short end of the stick if that cost you a Mahomes over rushing yards prop. But finding those discrepancies by shopping lines, you can set yourself up for bets in which you can't lose both, and you could quite possibly win both. And that, again, playing that out 20, 100 times, that's just a way to, that wasn't even an arbitrage play. That was just finding a massive middle and taking advantage. But those are the things you can do independent of handicapping a game, or to your point, independent of doing any more research, and just finding good numbers. So there's the ability to do that. And it's not limited to sports, by the way. Going back to the presidential election, most books had Biden in the range of minus 900 to minus 1,000 to win the popular vote. And even that, I think, was a short number, knowing what we do. I had one book, I don't know how this happened, and I did not ask any questions. I read the fine print several times before locking in the bet. Biden minus 300 to win the popular vote, not the Electoral College. So man, I placed it. I didn't get flagged. They paid it out fairly quickly. So just Steve Miller, take the money and run. I mean, when that happens, if you're not shopping lines, kind of to the point about being disciplined and planning your time, you can't place these crazy advantageous bets if you don't even know that they're being offered or where they're being offered. So having multiple outs, shopping lines, can be big. And I've talked a lot about these points applying to the NFL. Just gave an election example, but on a daily basis beyond major events, like what we talked about, you can often find an extra half point or 5 or 10 cents on a point spread or a total in any sport. And that's often what makes the difference between winning and losing in the long run. You don't need dozens of accounts, by the way. I know that it can be great to have as many outs as possible, but that does sound daunting. And if you're starting out on this journey, if you get too many accounts, having the bankroll can be a challenge. Having the time to shop all those lines can be a lot. Does it make sense? Like, roughly 3 is a good magic number to, to at least have a good variety of lines to shop?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and it's, it depends on, obviously, everyone's different, but having at least two or three, at least two, just to price shop each other at a bare minimum. But once you have three, and especially if they're like different reputations for different books, I know like offshore books, there's certain books that have reputations for being square, more likely to cater to square bettors, and some of them more to sharper bettors. And there's some books now that, it's the early days of the regulated U.S. market, but there's certain books out there that are gaining similar reputations, obviously here in the U.S. So having those, two of those books that are polar opposites, so to speak, in terms of their reputation, would be really advantageous if they let you bet with them, of course. But yeah, no, you could not stress that even better, because it's a thing that I've had multiple like new bettors tell me here in Illinois that haven't, that haven't been doing this at all, and they're interested in betting seriously, and getting action down every weekend. They told me that just shopping around for lines has been such a big difference for them early on. Just even having two or three books where they can compare pricing and compare options, you're going to get that extra half point. And to your point before about looking back, at your results previous months, or looking back at an entire season, do the same with the spreads that you're betting, and you'll be shocked at how many lost by the hook or lost by 1 point. And if you had that extra out that was giving you that extra point, where you were able to get a +6 instead of a +5.5 on a college basketball game or something like that, those are the most likely results. I mean, the most likely result, if the line's 6, is the game's going to land 6. The next two most likely results are 7 and 5. So if you're taking 5 instead of the 6, obviously you're giving away one of the most likely results. So it's something to always consider. But having that striving to always find the best number is the singular thing that I think that any bettor can put into play right away to stack the deck in their favor, I think.
Yeah, and I think one more point to kind of tie a bow around shopping for the best line or having multiple outs would be to touch on the process of creating accounts and doing your due diligence there. I think some offshore books now will prefer to use credit card. Increasingly, they want to go with Bitcoin. Some will accept both, but maybe have more friendlier terms with Bitcoin in terms of smaller withdrawal fees and faster payouts. So knowing what you're signing up for, just like we want to know what we're actually betting on, knowing the terms of engagement with the books that we're working with. Similarly, I like the point you brought up about some books leaning more sharp or more square. Some books are, going to have more extensive prop menus than others. Some books, precious few, but some still offer teasers at -110. A few charge more than the standard -120. Yeah. So depending on what you're looking to bet, just doing some homework prior to signing up can be really helpful. And also sign-up bonuses. Now it's such a competitive market. Know what strings are attached, but read the fine print and take advantage there. I think having a sense of what you're looking for and creating accounts that help round it out can be so beneficial. And I think the example, when I started betting, my goal is to have one book that I perceive to be sharp, one that I perceive to be square, and one that seemed to be somewhere in between. And just doing a little bit of homework, I think I was able to, find a good situation where that sharp book was a good spot. If I wanted to bet a favorite, a square book could be good to bet underdogs. Sharp books might be better for unders, sharp books better for overs, square books better for unders, just the way people generally bet. Again, there are exceptions to those rules of thumb, but I think sites like dimers.com, where we've done some work this season, they've been good partners to both of us. For legal US books, they have a lot of info on what's available based on what state you're in. And then again, sportsbookreview.com has a lot of good reviews on offshores, and those can be great resources just to start doing your research, so that when you want multiple outs to shop for the best lines, you can find, the optimal places to do that and use that to really be the foundation for your approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the one thing that, as bettors, if you're looking to become a better bettor immediately, it's the thing you could change today.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're down to one remaining tip. The number one tip to becoming a winning sports bettor over time. Mike, what's at the top of your list?
Bankroll management, and along with that, sticking to your unit size. And I'm sure I'm not so sure, but and we've touched on this concept, a couple of times with our top fives here, but it really is as simple as managing your bankroll. I know so many great handicappers out there, guys who originate their own numbers, and they're they're getting down. They know more about sports and sports betting than anybody on the face of the earth, but they're still bad bettors because they can't manage their bankroll and they get carried away. And this kind of ties in with everything we've talked about with embracing variance and obviously sticking to your unit size and avoiding all of the same biases that can obviously come up for anybody, but just embracing bankroll management and having that, striving to always stick to it, be very, I guess, like systematic with it, I guess is the best way to put it. Never varying from that approach, but have a bankroll, have a set amount of money that you're willing to lose, that you're comfortable losing, and keeping it separate from your normal finances, and then having a unit size based off that bankroll. And that's, that's where you can incorporate Kelly criteria, obviously, and that's, essentially staking an amount that's proportional to your perceived edge. And there's varying, I guess, theories on how to incorporate the Kelly criteria. And I know half Kelly's like maybe the prevailing viewpoint, half Kelly criterion when it comes to sports betting, just given the vagaries of betting and the variance that we've already discussed. But having a set amount, so never bet more than 1% to 2% of your bankroll on any one event, is a good thing to keep in mind as well. So have that amount, have it separate, your bankroll, and then bet accordingly, a small fraction, 1% to 2% of your bankroll per stake. Once you do it that way, it really frees your mind. You're able to withstand those longer losing streaks, and you're also not going to overreact to any longer winning streaks. You obviously can increase your unit size when your bankroll gets bigger, but staying true to your bankroll, staying true to your unit size is the one thing that you can control. You cannot control the outcome of the game. You can't control the bounces of the ball, but you can control how much you're staking, and you can control your bankroll.
Love it. So that is actually not my number one, but I think, again, some good overlap, and we can provide some perspective that hopefully provides a holistic approach here. I love that angle of, focusing on the controllables. And to that end, my number one piece of advice is to be selective. The biggest advantage I think we have as bettors is that ability to be selective, because sportsbooks have to post a line for every game. And we don't have to bet every game. And thank goodness for that, because as fun as that might be sometimes, most of the time they get those numbers right. Mm-hmm. So one of the biggest tips that I could share is, if you want to win, try to steer clear of the trap of needing to bet a game just because it's on. And especially would underscore that point when it comes to the notion of chasing or trying to make up for any losses that you've suffered recently. If you've had a losing Sunday betting football, it might be tempting to try to win back all the losses on Sunday Night Football. But unless that Sunday night line offers standalone value, kind of like what we talked about with hedging, then it's probably not a bet worth making. You can just as easily double your losses. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And it ties in with, again, that first point I brought up about having a goal and basing it around an identity that you're taking on more than a specific number that you're trying to hit. Because, let's face it sucks to have a losing week, or really sucks to have a losing month or a time span beyond that. But the end of any week or month or arbitrary period of time isn't really a finish line. The end of an NFL season, we're about to hit that. That's not the end of the finish line for people who, that's not a finish line for people who bet the NFL. So it can be easy to go on tilt at times, but doing that is a really good way to compound losses. And I think the less credence you give to a losing day or week or month, then the less of those that you'll have. Ultimately, it really, to me, comes down to picking your spots, focusing on the process over the outcome, and in the long run, trusting that a good process is a good outcome, and being selective is the cornerstone of that good process.
Perfectly said. And I know David Malinsky would definitely approve of that. It kind of goes along with what he always said, how much would you have bet if you knew this, or you knew this happened? And just so many things can happen in this business when you're betting sports, and you could have a team that's +5 on the turnover margin, but still inexplicably lost by 30 points or something. Every game's different. There are no sure things. And once you understand that and just embrace that, really, I think it really sets you free moving forward, and being selective, picking stuff that that you know more of, and understanding that the book usually is right. Usually when you bet into just picking random games, you're going to lose in the long run because of the VIG. But picking those spots and understanding that you're not forced to make those bets. It's better to not lose, the 110, like I said before, than it is to win the 100.
Yeah, Well, thank you so much for walking us through your top five. I think, well, we only really hit the nail on the head with one tip being the exact same. I think there's a lot of overlap here, and I still appreciate that there are plenty of areas where we didn't give the same advice, so that
Yeah.
from really granular, immediately applicable pieces of advice to some high level concepts that can, if nothing else, help you keep a better perspective in the long run. Like that, the whole spectrum comes into play when we're talking about becoming a winning better in the long run. So
Mhm.
really appreciate everything you came ready to speak to. I want to respect your time. I know we've been going at this for a while, so I'll try to do some rapid fire to wrap things up. Last time
I
we
got
had
all
some.
time, man. This is great. I mean, I could talk about this all day. This is fun for me, so don't worry about my time.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Yeah, if I could just do this until work starts tomorrow morning, and then keep going, I wouldn't mind it at all. But let's kick this off with one Super Bowl prop you're most looking forward to betting.
Oh man, I haven't thought about. It's just the ones I play every year. It's not that much fun, but just the ones that are more plus EV. So I'm sure I'll end up betting the. I think we mentioned it before. The yes on the will team score 3 consecutive times. A lot of people like to bet the no on that. You got to lay decent amount of vig to bet on the yes, but just getting too much value. Sometimes even like 60, 80 cents worth of market value on what we should be laying there. So stuff like that. It's not that fun, but that's it's just those markets, those prop markets where you lay a little bit of extra vig, um, but not as much as you should be. So that's it's not exciting, but that's what I'm most looking forward to.
Yeah, well, it's exciting when it wins, and I think people do like to see a lot of scoring. So at least that is a case of rooting for human achievement, at least for one side of the equation. So definitely more exciting than some of the other plus EV options. And when you talk about possibly getting 60 to 80 cents of a discount on this prop, I know this is another one where it's probably best to look toward in that final 24 to 48 hours before kickoff, maybe immediately right up to kickoff. But are you generally looking at something in the range of minus 200 to pull the trigger, or do you have a range of at a certain number, that's the bare minimum for a go, and then if you can get a better number, you're willing to play it for an increased amount up to something that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's in that range. Obviously, it depends on the total you're dealing with. In a game with a higher total like this one, 57, I still haven't gone through and looked at my go price on that one. Um, so yeah, no, I don't have an available go price there, but it's in that range for sure.
Cool. So Mike is on a team to score three straight times for up to minus 1,000.
Yeah,
And no.
no, I make probably my biggest bet of the entire Super Bowl if I got plus $10 on the other side. So that's the thing though
Yeah.
too. I mean, it's like when and for sports betting too, not to like add another thing on, but when people ask like, what do you like in this game or what do you like in this bet? The answer's got to be what's your line, because I would make one of my biggest bets at catching 10 to 1 odds on the other way. So there you go.
Yeah, my favorite prop for the Super Bowl. Again, it's been a stalwart all season long. Shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards, especially with the total we're seeing here in the range of 56 right now, depending on where you look. Again, this might as well be the official props and hops prop
Yeah.
bet of the season. And to the point of shopping lines, especially in the Super Bowl, I've found some outstanding prices on this in recent years. Throughout the regular season, was also surprised to see the variance from book to book with this prop. I think for this matchup, I would make it good up to a go price of minus 175. And I'm already seeing it posted at some books in the range of minus 145. So I see that as a good 30-cent discount. The Chiefs are obviously very explosive. I do wish they were more efficient near the goal line, so that puts a bit of a damper on my enthusiasm when looking at the matchup. But when I look at the high total here and the market tendency simply to price this prop too low, I still think this is a good bet. And the matchup seems great with the Bucks. Tom Brady is the master of the quarterback sneak. We saw him put that into play when they had the ball at the 1 against the Saints. If they're at the 1 in the Super Bowl, Brady sneaking it in is always quite possible. And then the Bucks' strong offensive line going against a pretty accommodating Chiefs defense, I think could also open the door for Leonard Fournette or Ronald Jones to find some room in short yardage situations. And then not having to be one dimensional on the ground, having some big pass catching options like Mike Evans and Rob Gronkowski make the passing game a viable option as well if the Bucks are operating on a short field. So just the likelihood of seeing a lot of points in this game increases the likelihood of a lot of touchdowns. That increases the odds of some 1-yard touchdowns. And from a matchup standpoint, especially with the Bucks, I'm liking it. But even the Chiefs, I mean, if they're gonna score 4 or 5 touchdowns, then more often than not, it might seem counterintuitive, but more often than not, one of those would come from the one. And we've seen that in each of their first 2 playoff games so far. So hopefully they can keep that recent run of efficiency near the goal line going for one more game.
Yeah, the big playability of both of these offenses, especially with Bruce Arians, who loves to air the ball out. The way that talk about at the beginning with Brady kind of slinging the pill a little more in the last game with confidence, can open up the door for more flags being thrown, and then you get those 1-yard punch-ins. Even if you have to count on CEH, the rookie, to punch one in from the 1-yard line, you're worried about the Chiefs' ground game in that scenario. Maybe that's being priced in. That's partially why you're seeing that minus 145 there.
Yeah, and it was encouraging to see how healthy Mahomes looked last Sunday, because in the divisional round, they just ran the speed option with him, so you didn't need to worry about a running back with a stout D line possibly making a goal line stand. Mahomes just around the end. Again, the Chiefs do have some options, especially when Mahomes is healthy. So seeing him look as good as he did this past Sunday, nursing that turf toe injury, with the bye week ahead, it's probably a good sign that we'll see him at or very close to full strength in the Super Bowl, and that could only help this prop as well.
Yeah, I think we'll be seeing plenty of those balls into the end zone. All it takes is one flag, and you're good.
Yeah. So we'll keep an eye out for that one. Also wanted to weave in a question outside of the 2 teams left standing in the NFL this season. You're in Chicago, you're a Bears fan. So had to ask, over under on how many wins the Bears cost themselves by backing into a futile playoff spot and keeping the less than inspiring trio in place when we look at GM, head coach, and quarterback.
My gosh, I tried to warn my friends about this. For savvy Chicago listeners, this reminds me of the 2016 Rajon Rondo Chicago Bulls that snuck in as the 8th seed in the playoffs, beat the Celtics the first 2 games when Rondo was healthy. Then he gets injured and they lose the next 4. Everybody sticks around for another year, and then you just have an extra year before you have to rebuild and pick a lane, so to speak. So for the Bears, I'm seeing a similar spot where they reeled off those wins in the middle of the season, and it put the blinders on. Even my friends that are big Bears fans, I was telling them, we're in big danger here. And I was comparing them to your Chargers, who were going down the same route, to close out the season. Dicey. And we were talking at that point, down the stretch when the Chargers and the Bears both reeling off wins. It's like, who has it worse right now? And turned out that it was the Bears, because they snuck in with that last spot. And sure enough, it all starts at the top, and they're keeping around, pace and Matt Nagy. And it's just another year of the same. And just like the Rondo Bulls, it's just delaying what's inevitably going to happen. So to answer your question, at least 16 games, at least delayed us another year, I think. And it sucks to say, but I think that's true. Just a couple of those early wins, if they just didn't go, because the Bears were one of the luckiest teams to start the year with those close wins, games they had no business winning. Starting off at their first game against the Lions with that, there's a lot. I mean,
DeAndre Swift is still looking for his hands.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even before that, I think it was that play was just like the cherry on top. And that was like the Bears season in a nutshell, basically. Just getting so fortunate there. And it's going to open up betting opportunity, I think, fading the Bears next year potentially. But now I'm worried about what they're going to do this offseason, thinking that it's, they have like a 1-year window and they're going to splurge for a quarterback or something at the, sacrificing the future in the process. So yeah, the Bears are stuck in football purgatory, which is effectively football hell right now.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to think about this from a more macro, again, process versus result point of view, because if the NFL hadn't expanded the playoff field, then Trubisky, Nagy, and Pace are all likely looking for work right now. And that has zero impact on how they performed. It's amazing that the Bears got the 7th seed in the NFC, and meanwhile there were teams that won double digits in the AFC and they didn't all get in. So it's just amazing the way that this shook out, that because the playoff field was expanded, to no credit of anybody sticking around in Chicago, those guys are still around. It just goes to show what kind of process goes into some of these decisions and how dumbfounding that can be despite how high the stakes are.
Yeah, I know these guys. I mean, it's like the best possible jobs in the world. And even people, I mean, you and I can clearly see this, sitting in these rooms talking over Zoom right now, we could see the problems, and yet they still have their jobs. We know the result already. hate to break it to you Bears fans, but I know the result already. And I hope I'm wrong, but it's painful. It is how it is. And we've seen this movie before with other teams here in Chicago. And it really is par for the course. My dad's been telling me I was pretty much a product of the Bears' last Super Bowl. I was born exactly 9 months later, pretty much. So it's, my dad's told me since I can ever remember, they're just going to let you down, son. You can't trust them. It starts at the top. And, it's really the past couple of years where I've really started to understand that, where he's coming from.
Yeah, well, let's ease up on the pain a little bit, because in addition to being a Bears fan, you're an Iowa Hawkeyes fan, with Iowa being your alma mater. They're looking pretty good in basketball right now. So how far do you think your Hawkeyes are going to go this season?
Oh man, no, I love and basketball is my favorite sport too, and it's killing me because they just played Northwestern here in Chicago last weekend, or maybe it was the weekend before, on Sunday, and I couldn't go see them. So and it really stinks that I won't be able to see Luka Garza and this team play in person this year, especially since they're a team that's so exciting to watch. They're number one in adjusted offensive efficiency at KenPom, which is basically how many points you expect to score in 100 possessions versus an average D1 opponent. They're the best in the nation. Obviously, defensively, they have some issues, but they're one of the most exciting teams to watch. Luka Garza and all the 3-point shooters around him. So a team like that has a lot more variance, obviously, on offense. They can get scored on, but if they're hot for a couple games against the right teams, they can go the whole way. So my expectations are high for them. I think, I would love to see them make the Final Four. I think Elite Eight is a realistic ask from this team this year, but it's going to come down to obviously tournament variance and who they're matched up against to see really how far they can go. But they could beat anybody on any given night, and if they're shooting the ball well, they could make a deep run into March Madness.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you've got something to look forward to while waiting out the Bears. So it'll be an interesting next few weeks, next couple of months for Iowa basketball. And to wrap up the rapid fire round here, putting the hops back in props and hops, what is the beer that you have enjoyed the most so far in 2021?
I got to say, it might be, there's been quite a few, but this one right here, the one that I brought on the show, the pistachio cream ale from Vera, I've been drinking it the most, so if that counts. But other than that, just having any of my Chicago beers handy, I've been really into. I think we talked about maybe on your last pod, but I'm still drinking the Lei Juice. Probably not pronouncing it the right way, but that's here in Chicago as well. Alarmist Brewing Company. But yeah, this new one, 2021. It's a young year so far, but I've been really into this pistachio cream ale.
Yeah, I'm gonna go the same route and go with the one I've been working on tonight. And for a lot of the year, I think, to your point, if it's the one that you're drinking the most from a volume standpoint, then it's probably a sign of how much you're enjoying it. So again, this one is a Kolsch Rough Translation by Green Cheek Beer Company in Orange, California. And what I love is that it's not too hoppy. So even though this is props and hops, that seems a little counterintuitive, but it seems like the optimal play call when we're working with long days of watching playoff football. Those have just been great the past few weeks, and this has been a go-to, because as much as I love a good IPA, probably less inclined to really ramp up the volume with something that's more in the 7-8% range. So Rough Translation has been great. Just love the Kolsch style. This one's, again, light enough to drink plenty of, but still keep your wits about you, and just fresh baked bread on the aroma. It's so almost entrancing. Not to get too in the weeds on this, but also a little floral and fruity on the flavor, and that gives it enough nuance to be interesting. But it's also pretty clean and simple by design, just to be more enjoyable and crushable no matter what you've got going on. So yeah, it might be winter warmer season, but there are still some good Kolsch's, cream ales, and other things on the lighter end of the spectrum that we can be enjoying right now.
Yep, you can drink more of them on a fun football Sunday too.
Yeah, cool. Well, one thing I wanted to touch on before we get on out of here would be to speak to being part of the Dimers.com podcasting network throughout the season. You started working with them, I believe it was just about from the get-go. And then I came on board a little bit later, thanks to an intro that you facilitated. And I was curious to hear a little bit about your experience working with the team over at Dimers and being the sponsor of their weekly Sweet Six contests they've been running.
Yeah, Dimers guys are the best, and like I just love the community that they're trying to build here as the U.S. sports betting industry continues to expand over time and quickly at that too. But I love how they're really helping facilitate the right way of thinking for a lot of bettors who are interested in learning more about this, because you and I have been in those shoes. When we're trying to find good sources of information to make informed bets while having fun at the same time. And so the quick pick section at Dimers, I think, is great in the sense that it teaches bettors, that are looking at that it really is just about assembling edges, like we've talked about, and assembling a portfolio every day built on smaller edges. And so when you see that, even the very best Dimers bot bets on the quick pick section are yielding 6 to 10% edges at the very best, and you're accepting the fact that even the best bets you're going to make have at best a 40% chance of losing. Once you get in that mindset, it really can change the way you bet, and you're going to bet accordingly. So I think the Dimers community is good from that regard. Also, just getting like-minded bettors who can bring really insightful handicapping angles into handicapping different sports and different games, because obviously some guys might specialize in one sport and some guys in another sport. And then the Sweet Six is great. It's 6 picks per week, per week during the regular season, and then we did special, for the NFC and AFC championship games, one for each game. Obviously, there'll be one for the Super Bowl, but you get 6 questions, and those vary. Some of them are just 50-50, who's going to win this matchup, and some of them are who's going to be the first touchdown scorer. You might get like an index question if the margin of victory is going to be between 1 and 5 points, 6 and 10, but you just have to answer 6 of those 6 correctly, all 6, and you win $1,000. So it's really just a fun idea, I think, to get more potential bettors engaged and in the community. And yeah, so I'm really happy to sponsor that with the Doggy Juice podcast, and encourage all of you listeners out there to participate in the Sweet Six moving forward.
Yeah, and something I like about the Sweet Six, as you described it, reminds me of the notion of prop betting for the Super Bowl aligning with your game handicap. The Sweet Six contest, that's a free roll. It takes less than a minute to enter. And if you've done the game handicaps and you have a certain feel for how you think things are going to go, this is a quick, free, and an easy way to just throw your name in the hat for a free roll on $1,000. I always like to think of it as, if things fall into place, then that $1,000 can effectively pay for free beers for years. And what's better than that? So
Nothing.
yeah, good answer. So I enjoy that. Quick picks is one of my preferred spots to check out on dimers.com as well. You touched on it well. A 6% edge is actually quite large, so it's good to set that perspective. And also, even though I'm in California, unfortunately probably quite a ways out from legalized sports betting, just the state by state breakdowns of different sports books, what they're offering, again, helping people learn how they can best take advantage of bonuses or whatever options are available based on where they're located. Dimers.com has been a good resource on that front. So yeah, happy to be part of that family. And I also want to give you time to take the floor here and plug the Doggy Juice Pod. What do you got going on for Super Bowl coverage plans, and then post Super Bowl, just in general? How are you looking to take the show over the next coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so no, the Doggy Juice podcast, it's I view it as your one-stop shop for sports betting legalization state by state. If you're interested in those developments, to try and stay on top of those on a weekly basis, but also just learning to, and just like this podcast with Props and Hops, learning to find ways, for anyone who's looking to find ways to be a sharper sports bettor, to put things in your arsenal that are going to equip you for the long run, and not just like a hot take who's going to cover the spread this week, and stuff that really helps teach a person how to fish so they can earn a living instead of just a hot take. So that's kind of the focus of the podcast, is to go about it in that route, and provide more of that type of content. And moving forward, I'm going to probably be doing it. I usually release on Thursdays during football season, but now that we're coming out of football season, I'm probably going to be doing a bit of a schedule shift and try and do more interviews and more evergreen content to try and provide more content that can actually accomplish that goal of providing source for bettors to understand how to change their process and equip themselves with the skills to succeed in the long run moving forward. But also a lot of college basketball talk too, because that's my favorite sport to handicap as well. And obviously we're approaching March Madness, so yeah, it's a lot of fun. Just a weekly podcast, just like yours, and looking forward to bringing you on as a guest again soon, and as many times as I can get my hands on you to get on the podcast, because I love your insight as well.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I had a blast going on before and happy to do it anytime. And to your point about college basketball picking up soon, I mean, right after the Super Bowl, it's pretty much going to be at a fever pitch until the big dance. So, Doggy Juice Pod going to be a good resource for that. And yeah, I look at the clock here and I see that pushing ahead 2 hours to convert to Central Time, I think we might be approaching your bedtime. You've been more than generous with your time here. Thank you so much for hopping on to have this discussion. And I'm really looking forward to whenever and wherever we can catch up in person next, whether that's Chicago, LA, Vegas, wherever it is, sign me up. Can't wait for it. But in the meantime, looking forward to more conversations like this, either here with Props and Hops or on the Doggy Juice Pod.
Can't wait, Matt. Thank you so much for having me on. I mean, think of all like the bad movies that listeners could have watched or done stuff with their time with that 2 hours instead of listening to this. Hopefully, we were able to provide some really good information for people that can put into their arsenal right away and start seeing more winning tickets. So I really appreciate you having me on. It's an honor to come on here, and I love what you're doing with this podcast. I think it's so unique, especially bringing your beer knowledge and just your unique angle, having worked with David Malinsky and stuff on him. This is a must listen for me personally, and I know a lot of friends here in the Chicago area have been introduced to it, feel the same way. So really appreciate all you do, and I'm honored to come on. So cheers to you, man.
Cool. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Mike. Cheers.
Cheers.